Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And I wanted to welcome tonight our special guest, Dr. Laura Forsberg, who is an assistant professor of English at Rockhurst University in Kansas City. And she's a literary historian of Victorian culture and completed her book, Worlds Beyond Miniatures and Victorian Fiction, with the support of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in Southern California. We had fun talking about the Huntington, which we both love. She earned her BA from Princeton and her PhD from Harvard. So she comes with great bona fides, but also comes with a very fascinating topic, which I think aligns with many things that we at the Athenaeum are interested in: literature and built worlds and Victoriana. So we look forward to hearing your talk. And although we cannot see you and you cannot see all of our audience, I invite everybody to join me virtually in welcoming Dr. Laura Forsberg to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia this evening.
Thank you so much, Beth. It is such a pleasure to be here virtually with all of you. And it is a particular pleasure to be talking to people who have, well, I've already seen a sort of fascinating collection of interests that have been being named in the chat. And I look forward to a robust discussion in the Q&A following this talk. I'm going to be talking a lot about a lot of the cultural elements and the material elements of my project tonight. But I'm happy also to expand on a lot of the literary ones again in the Q&A following. So I'm going to pull up some slides, so hopefully you will be able to see these. Today's talk is inspired by the title of my book, so it is Worlds Beyond Miniatures and Victorian Fiction. I'd like to begin today's talk by introducing you to 4 objects that reflect key parts of my research and thinking. And I think introduce is a good term because when we're meeting something, we have to learn a little bit about it and a little bit about its context. And so to find these, we'll not just be looking in the traditional area that scholars look, the library, but we'll also be traveling to the art museum, we'll be traveling to the laboratory, and we'll be traveling to the nursery. The first object I'd like to introduce you to is a carry-type microscope from the 19th century. So this was a portable microscope, which meant that it could be entirely compacted in a small wooden box. You can actually see the lenses fit together, and you could lift up the top section in order to see a space where you could store either slides that you'd purchased or slides that you were going to make. Once the naturalist wanted to use the microscope, it could be unfolded and screwed into the top of the box itself, so that the box became a part of the object and the sort of idea of the carrying case became a part of the thing itself. Of course, no one really, or at least most of us, don't really value microscopes just for themselves as objects. We value them for what they allow us to see. So the view through this microscope, which still works today, is of course more impressive than its collapsible form. Beneath the slide, and this is a 19th century slide handmade by one of the owners of it, a few dots could turn into, in this case, the flea of a rabbit. So this was a purchased slide that then was specially prepared by the owner of it. Suddenly, from the lens of a working object came a form of enchantment. Object 2 is a marvel of craftsmanship in the age of print. An English Bijou Almanac for 1838, which measures about 3/4 by 9/16 of an inch. That makes it about the size of a penny. One of the first challenges of reading this book is just trying to keep it open without having your fingers block the entirety of the pages. So you can see this is a professional photograph that I'll talk about in a second. My version has my fingers like horribly obtruding onto the pages. In order to photograph this, which was photographed at the Huntington Library for me, the curators actually built a stand. They built like a nest for the book. They created strings to hold down the pages, and then they photographed each page before sewing it together into a single image. And that's just to try to get one image of one book, much less try to read it. Most editions of the English Bijou Almanac came in these sort of exquisite cases. So with these elaborate arabesque designs. So on the far left, you see the actual book, and then it fit inside a case with its title. Sometimes they also came in elaborate Morocco cases that would have magnifying glasses that you could use to read the minuscule print. Inside, there are a series of ostensibly useful reference tables. Good luck reading the entirety of them, alongside these striking pen illustrations, such as this one of Queen Victoria, which is clearly trying to bring the Queen's authority to this marvel of print. The presentation page for this particular version invites the giver of this book to inscribe a recipient's name. But as you can see from the recipient's attempt to put their own name in, it's dated 1848, so this was sort of regifted a little bit after it was printed. It's not actually really possible to write on the sort of scale that the presentation page suggests. That the actual scale of what we can write as ordinary people is different from what the volume invites us to do. And so instead, the volume becomes this kind of fantasy, this what if, this possibility that we might become part of a world that is slightly smaller than the one we inhabit. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the public experienced this volume as an almost otherworldly object of enchantment. So they described it as a Lilliputian pygmy among annuals, a fitting present for Titania, a fairy trifle. And the editor was milking it for all it was worth. In one poem, in a preface to a different edition of the same volume, he describes, I quote again, "Our little book seems planned by elfin touch in elfin land and sent by Oberon, I ween, an offering to our English queen." So the fairies from Midsummer Night's Dream become the figures who present to Victoria this enchanting little book. Object 3 represents what Queen Victoria herself chose to adorn herself with. This is a bracelet featuring the enamel portraits of 9 of Queen Victoria's children, each painted as they reached the age of 4. Portrait miniatures have a long history of being cherished as objects which brought the owner and object physically close together. So the owner could wear a miniature around her neck. She could clasp it in her hand, press it to her cheek, keep it in the pocket. And that physical proximity became a sort of substitute for physical presence. So the idea was that this made the represented subject always there and doted on physically. This bracelet was given to Queen Victoria on her 26th birthday by her beloved husband, Albert. And at the time, it had exactly one image, the portrait of Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, Victoria. And then gradually it expanded, and they had to do a second bracelet because Queen Victoria had a heck of a lot of children. The visible part of the portrait is just 2.2 centimeters in diameter. So that makes it a little bit less than an inch. And they were all painted by this renowned miniaturist and decked with this enamel decoration and with 4 pearls around each one to represent the preciousness of the object. The preciousness of the object, of course, came in large part because of the sentimental attachment, which means that on the reverse side, each image was inscribed not just with the name and birth date, but also the date that the child was painted. And you can barely see it in the image here, but behind each image is a lock of the child's hair. So that Queen Victoria was actually wearing on the inside part of the bracelet the hair, the physical bodies of her children. Victoria treasured these and literally hundreds of other portrait miniatures, some of which are slightly less tasteful than this one. My favorite tasteless example is this absolutely fantastic brooch that she had done. This is the same Princess Victoria. Initially, it was a portrait miniature where she just had wings, and then Victoria thought, what the heck, let's bejewel them and make them into a brooch. So these were not always to modern aesthetic tastes. But what makes them so marvelous is the idea, which Queen Victoria took very seriously, that she needed to have her children, and I quote again, always with me. They were enchanting tokens of the beloved child, of the deceased spouse after her husband Albert died, and of a time that was past but forever present. The fourth object I'd like you to meet is a dollhouse that belonged to Annie Horatia Jones. It now sits in the Toy and Miniatures Museum, which, if you haven't visited, is a little treasure house in Kansas City. This cabinet-style dollhouse originally actually belonged to Annie's mother. So the entire section on the right, including the staircase, was made in the 1860s. And then Annie had the left section added on and also the base added on. And this was actually funded by her father, who is a very noted London architect. The dollhouse itself is an incredibly eclectic combination of things. And some of them are purchased and some of them are handmade. So all of the rugs in the house were made by Annie herself. They were sewing projects as she beautified this baby house, as they used to be called. And then on the walls, she actually hand decorated this again with clippings and papers so that it becomes this kind of collage of images that she's imagining, if not herself, she's imagining a baby of her own being surrounded with in this nursery. Annie's aunt further contributed to this. And unfortunately, these aren't housed with the dollhouse anymore, but with a set of 10 dolls as well, which were meant to represent specific members of Annie's family. The one in the middle represents Annie's father. And these dolls were carefully dressed by Annie's aunt, and they had sewn on tags. You can see just on the bottom of her father's coat, a tag making sure that the doll's name is clearly labeled. These dolls, again, don't quite fit the proportions of some of the other spaces. This is characteristic of Victorian dollhouses, that you're mingling multiple scales. And this was particularly the case with this figure of Annie's father, who is a full 2 inches taller than any of the other 2 dolls. Now, we can read this as emblematic of Victorian gender norms, where the man is going to be sized much larger than the women. But I think the more important thing from my perspective is that this very imperfection is indicating the ways in which it doesn't really matter if one of the dolls is taller than the others. It doesn't provide any sort of interference to the child's imagination, and may in fact give her opportunity to take ownership over it. After all, it also seems to be no barrier to her imagination that there are absolutely no doors into more than half of the rooms in the house. So if you look at both of the pictures, top and bottom, you'll see there's absolutely no way in except through the open front. The sheer diversity of these objects that I've just named, which represent frontiers in science and printing and art and design, traditionally places them in radically different conversations. My guess is that most of the time you don't end up seeing some of these strange things together. And it also means that we think of them differently. We look at a microscope and think that is something that we need to take seriously. We look at well, okay, I'm editorializing, somewhat ridiculous brooch of Queen Victoria's daughter, and we think like, okay, this is a little silly. We look at a dollhouse and think, wow, I wish I had that as a child. Those are radically different emotional reactions for us to be having. And I think our tendency to divide and categorize these things actually prevents us from noting more essential similarities. It prevents us from noticing the fact that there are uniting impulses towards enchantment, towards world creating, and towards imagination uniting them. My book, Worlds Beyond Miniatures and Victorian Fiction, brief plug, is exploring what it means. Well, I guess this whole talk is a plug, but this is the plug part, is exploring what it means to be tying objects together through the shared preoccupation with their scale. And in so doing, I'm arguing that the core impulse uniting these objects is a search for enchantment, and specifically a search that lies just at or just beyond the limits of what we can see. I'll come back to this later, but I want to spend just a few minutes talking about where this came from, how I began looking into this. So in 2010, as a graduate student at Harvard, I became fascinated, as many a Harvard graduate student has before me, with a set of 9 miniature books produced by Charlotte and Branwell Brontë. And the Houghton Library does sometimes display them, but they guard them jealously in terms of touching them. So these are definitely not my hands, although I did get to see them some. So these miniature manuscripts measure about 2 by 1.5 inches in size, and they're carefully crafted to imitate contemporary periodicals, but they're made on a scale to match a set of toy soldiers that Branwell was given by his father. Each is inscribed with writing in a tiny script that is almost impossible to read without a magnifying glass. And while individuals often speculate that this may have been in order to protect the contents from father's prying eyes, what child would not want to have a secret script that dad couldn't read or mom couldn't read? We also know that many of these periodicals are ostensibly authored by the toy soldiers themselves, which means that the size of the script is actually sustaining a vision of authorship. Today, in the 19th century and today, these manuscripts have sort of hovered on the edge of scholarly and peripheral consciousness. They are almost too strange to be believed. For me, and these are a couple more images of the Brontë miniatures, the Brontë miniatures suggested a new approach to something that I'd been tracking for some time, namely a Victorian fascination with scale. I'd spent years reading Victorian novels, periodicals, scientific treatises, children's books, and looking for evidence of scale. And I'd noticed these patterns where women and children are being consistently associated with miniatures. And I thought, well, this makes sense. Women and children are being sort of symbolically diminished within cultures. They're associated with small things. Therefore, we're indicating that none of these things really matter all that much. And what the Brontë miniatures suggested was a different way to think about this. Namely, maybe things are really small, not just as a protective impulse, but also as a way of rewriting what the world looks like, recentering it in a way that actually allowed those female, childish, other perspectives to suddenly become central. So for example, on this title page of Blackwood's at Young Men's Magazine, which is very much modeled on Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, Charlotte Brontë not just gives herself the title of genius, which is her singular of genie, but still genius, it's pretty good. But she also puts her initials where the editor's picture goes in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. So she's making herself this sort of grand masculine figure. And that's not even vaguely the craziest thing they do. The Brontes actually create this kingdom in West Africa, this kingdom of Angria, in which they recreate, and I show here on the left, a map from one of their geography books, and on the right, a map they themselves made. They actually recreate the Napoleonic Wars and imagine what if they happened not in Europe, but in fact in West Africa, and actually create a kingdom. My favorite is that they create a kingdom of Frenchy land, which is actually an island off the coast, in addition to, Sneaky's land and some of their other aptly titled Stump's land and some of their other aptly titled places. So the miniature actually became a way to express and to explore an aspiration for and an exploration of grandeur and power. And I suddenly saw it everywhere. I saw Victorian scientific guides that looked very serious and not like things I particularly wanted to read, suddenly exploding into descriptions. So here I suddenly stumbled onto a description of an orange-tipped butterfly, and there is definitely a human face on this butterfly. These objects just suddenly appeared. 19th century printers aspired to mimic fairy art and described their books as authored by Shakespeare's mischievous Puck. Some of the places I found miniatures made sense. It will not surprise anyone that I discuss Alice in Wonderland at some length. But they also appeared in many more surprising ones, in novels by Charles Dickens, Henry James, George Eliot, Charlotte Brontë, in minor genres like the doll narrative and what I call the fairy science tract. I saw them in records from art museums with clusters of portrait miniatures on the wall. In libraries, this is a shelf from the Huntington Stacks with the collections of one of their collectors. In laboratories, another, I'm slightly cheating, late 18th century instrument. And in dollhouses. What all of this suggests is an incredibly heterogeneous collection of objects that seem to be grasping towards some sort of edge of tininess. And what I'd like to suggest is that these extremely diverse objects are in fact united by two conditions. The first is that holding one of these objects or creating one of these objects meant transforming reality. We tend to think of miniature objects as you took the big thing and then you just made it smaller. But as anyone who makes miniature objects, and I think we might have a few in the audience tonight, knows, that is not how it works. We actually need to adjust the proportions of an object in order to make it look the same to the human eye. And this becomes perhaps most evident in a modern phenomenon called tilt-shift photography, where full-size objects are photographed in a way to make them look like miniatures. So use a very shallow depth field perception, you photograph from above, and suddenly all of these objects that we might see look like matchbox cars, crazy trains, and Wild West sets that we might buy, again, for our children or for ourselves. Why not? What all of this suggests is that miniatures aren't just miniature, they are reality with a difference. They are marked by a separation. And that separation leads me to my second conclusion, which is that while Victorian miniatures are always engaged with what it means, what the full-scale equivalent might be, familiar things become strange when they are miniaturized. Miniatures destabilize what it means to be a part of our world. They create an uncertainty, and that uncertainty is fundamentally yoked to the microscopic world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about microscopes, and then we're going to segue back into a few miniatures. So the enchantment of Victorian miniatures occurred in tandem with the era's growing acceptance of empirical science. Microscopes became increasingly popular and accessible in the 1840s and 50s, offering a glimpse into something that couldn't quite be viewed. And the widespread popularity of microscopes didn't serve to dispel the feeling that there were regions of enchantment in the natural world. It actually served to heighten it. And part of it was because naturally a lot of individuals looked at the aptly titled water bears and then sort of morphed them a little bit so they looked even more bear-like. But it also meant that many users, with the sort of subjectivity of vision, saw fairies alongside their flagella. So I have an illustration here from Philip Henry Goss's Evenings at the Microscope with the layers of mythologies, these mythological creatures sort of waving, and he elaborately describes this. And this isn't bad science. Goss is an incredibly well-respected figure. It is, in fact, an emphasis on the idea that what you see matters, even if it seems to be enchanted. And so this actually became a scientific principle whereby microscopists urged individuals to look through the lens and see enchantment. Charles Kingsley, most famous maybe for water babies, but also a renowned naturalist, described it like this. He said, and again, I quote, "Go to the water butt in the nearest yard, and there in one pinch of green scum, in one spoonful of water, behold a whole Divina Commedia of living forms, more fantastic 1,000 times than those with which Dante peopled his unseen world." And I pair this with an illustration from Punch, in which this sort of idea of microscopist as voyager is clearly shown. So this Victorian gentleman in his waistcoat acquires a microscope as his nose, acquires a tail that makes him like the creatures he is pictured among. And meanwhile, these pests that surround him have sort of beautifully human and either terrified or mischievous features. I particularly love the sort of mischievous one carrying the casket on the immediate right of the microscopist. But there's a blurring, there's an idea that what you've done is actually begun a journey into a place that is going to radically change how you experience the world. This rise in popular microscopy and in microscopy as a sort of tool of enchantment strikingly coincided with a shift in the ways in which fairies were being viewed. So in British folklore, fairies are often conceived of as small but not miniature, so maybe like 3 feet or so in height. But beginning in the late 18th century, an illustrator named Thomas Stothard first came up with the idea to be representing fairies, or in this case, a sylph from Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, with butterfly wings. And I sort of love, according to a widely reprinted legend, Stothard had this idea suggested to him, put butterfly wings on the fairies. And he got so excited, he immediately got up and he was like, "I must be correct." And then he ran out into the natural world, caught himself a butterfly, brought it back, and started making his sylph. And this sort of suggests the seriousness with which these objects or these creatures of fancy are being viewed. These aren't just something that is imaginary. They are something that is fundamentally yoking combining the imaginative and the real. So Stoddard's conception really takes off, and artists begin blending naturalistic observations with fanciful imagination to produce this sort of era of fairy art that flourishes in the mid-19th century. So John Anster Fitzgerald, very, very endearingly sometimes called Fairy Fitzgerald, starts painting fairies in conflict or in harmony with the natural world. Here we see fairy hordes attacking a bat, but elsewhere he imagines them in a sort of animalistic conflict with robins and mice. Equally, he imagines fairies feeding squirrels and also nursing rabbits. And we can see this sort of harmonious relationship. And what I think is really important are, well, what I think are important are two things. First of all, that fairies are imagined as having their habits smoothly fitting in with what other natural creatures are imagining. It's like just fill in the dots and they could be there where you've never quite seen them. But second of all, Fitzgerald and others are asking us to look more closely. They're asking us to be more attentive as viewers, and they're asking us, and they're suggesting that a real transformation could take place if we're willing to do so. Richard Dadd, who is an even more unusual painter, his masterpiece, Fairyfeller's Masterstroke. If you have no idea what's going on in this painting, you're right on track. He suggests an even sort of denser version of this. What is ostensibly happening is in the center, there's a woodcutter who is splitting open an acorn that is going to become part of Queen Mab's carriage. But what we see is just a tangled mass of vegetation that are actually overshadowing anything that we might see. And when we see the fairies, they're sort of strange and weird and warped versions of whatever we might imagine encountering in our life. This is not just a children's version of fancy, although it is certainly building into that, but this is a vision that is suggesting that enchantment can be dangerous, that it can be transformative. This discovery of enchantment is not just limited to this realm of sort of fairies and science. So printers are equally seeking to manufacture fairyland by producing volumes of unprecedented beauty and impossibly small size. Throughout the 19th century, developments in printing technology meant that there was this sudden boom in books that were produced on a miniature scale. And I'm defining that as less than 3 inches or less than 3 inches in size. In prior centuries, most volumes were prayer books or Bibles. But in the 19th century, you suddenly see an explosion into almanacs, libraries, alphabets, even samplers, globes with pictures of individuals costumed from dresses across the world. About 650 miniature books, unique miniature books, were produced in the 18th century. From 650, that explodes to 3,000 in the 19th century. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, these volumes were often difficult to read and difficult to manipulate, but they appealed to purchasers precisely because they said that reading was irrelevant. You didn't have to see what the contents were in order to gain the benefits of ownership. That possession somehow gave you, allowed you to know everything within these volumes' diminutive bounds. To give you an example of this, I want to just briefly glance at one of my favorite miniature Bibles, sometimes called thumb Bibles from the period, which decided to offer some elaborate promises to parents for what their children would gain if they purchased this somewhat but not terribly expensive volume. So again, I quote, the editor addresses children directly, not at all their parents, noting, after you've read this through, you will wish to know more about the Bible. Your mama will get you one or let you take hers, and you will learn much more than we had room to tell you. So by osmosis, the child who owns this book is going to become inculcated in all of these principles of religion. And in fact, you turn to the frontispiece and we see another example of it. Children poring over the volume. They're poring over an illustration. This was a story that was very, very popular in the 19th century, has fallen out of favor today, about children who torment the prophet Elijah, and then they're ripped up by bears. So these children are learning their lesson. There are bears carrying the children. Oh, what wicked children there were. Of course, any self-respecting child is also going to note this page reference on the bottom of the page, and will immediately turn to page 94, where they will get a delightful image of bears tearing children apart that doesn't quite seem to be inculcating the religious principle. I mean, maybe it does, but seems to potentially have other attractions than just the religious principles that parents are going for. For one set of miniature book publishers across Europe, this goes even further, and a race came on to produce tiny volumes with the smallest print possible. So in 1834, Antonio Farina of Milan cut what he called occhio di mosca, or fly's eye type, that's almost illegible. The first volume was not set until 30 years later. It was an edition, a partial edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, and it took 11 years to complete, and ruined several people's eyesight who were working on the project. About 30 years later, the Salomon brothers of Padua decided to produce a second volume, and they decided to print a letter from Galileo to Madama Cristina de Lorena. And so this is a meditation on the nature of astronomy, condensed into a book that is about half the size of a postage stamp. It's not an accident that we're condensing the universe into the smallest bounds. If miniature books suggest the sort of importance of perfection in miniaturization, other miniatures suggest that in fact imperfections can equally be an invitation to create new worlds. So I'm briefly going to return to dollhouses as the final sort of piece of my talk today. We tend to think about dollhouses as objects of didactic instruction, things that, like that thumb Bible promised, are going to teach girls to be good ladies of the household. But as soon as we start to see, to look at usage records from the period, we start to see something different. So here you can see some very well-dressed girls with some dolls sort of collapsing in the background when they aren't getting full attention from their owners. Part of these imperfections came from the simple facts of the objects themselves. So objects in a house, especially when some were manufactured by children, as they often were in the 19th century, are often out of proportion with each other. Doors and staircases are often missing. And as you can see with this elegant gentleman on the left, dollhouse dolls had a famous inability to sit up by themselves. They had a very inelegant tendency to slide straight to the floor. We can't, of course, tell exactly how 19th century children chose to play with their dolls, but we do start to get still more transgressive hints if we look at material evidence. So for example, one 19th century dollhouse that had remained undisturbed for many, many years had a doll that was mysteriously hiding beneath a mattress. Not sure what was going on there. Mary Shelley's childhood dollhouse included a doll in men's pants, wearing an apron and lying on a four-poster bed. Often, male dolls would have their legs broken off in the course of childish play, and girls or boys who were playing with them would simply put on a dress that the sex of these dolls would change rapidly. The imagination of the child rapidly compensated for the shortcomings of a toy. As you can see here, if neither the doll nor the child could quite fit into the dollhouse, and if the child wanted to bring a goat with her into the game of play, all of this was permissible as long as the child's imagination is at work. And what emerges from these principles of play is the very real possibility that children could become agents in world making. For while, of course, Victorian children were praised for forms of play that involved sitting dolls down for lessons and dressing them for dinner, many, again, of the records suggest that other more violent forms were far more common. Frances Hodgson Burnett recalls how in her childhood, her doll regularly became Bloody Mary of England, faced pirates in shark-infested waters, and participated in Aztec ceremonies and rites. We can see these sort of vibrant imaginings giving birth to Lewis Carroll's Alice books, but we can also see an entire genre of doll narratives that emerges in which often decrepit dolls narrate the adventures of their life. And these adventures aren't coded as sort of negative in Victorian culture, but are understood as a part of the vibrancy of the child's imagination and her engagement with the fantasy that this doll is in fact real, that this doll had in fact opened up realms that were previously inaccessible to her. So in my book, Worlds Beyond, Miniatures in Victorian Fiction, I begin with the tradition of portrait miniatures and I end with the transformation of literature itself into a miniature object. So it ends up concluding with miniature books itself. And in so doing, what I'm really searching out is the relationship, a century-long relationship between the British and their miniatures. The ways in which individually and together these miniatures pointed beyond their physical forms and aided their owners in world-making imaginings. To encounter these miniatures during the Victorian period was not just to be awed by the beauty and intricacy of the objects, although I certainly found myself repeatedly stunned by that, but also to be struck by the power of the imaginative mind, to be struck by the power of the mind that extrapolates from the imperfections, from the gaps in knowledge, from the areas outside the microscopic stage, to imagine new worlds and new ways of being. So Victorian miniatures emerge in my book as material traces of all the imagined worlds lying just beyond human perception. So thank you so much, and I look forward to a little conversation.
Thank you, Laura. That was really fascinating. I was struck as you were talking with by bringing in the microscope, that this really was all in this period with the fascination of the natural world and collecting and dissecting and learning about plants and animals and what happens inside animals and outside and how they function and form, and how that seemed to collide here or intersect with the fascination with other things that are miniature.
I think this is so true. And I think for me too, this has been, I sort of came into this project with a really two culture, what's sometimes described as the two cultures model, where there's the sort of scientific culture and then there's the imaginative culture, and they are fundamentally opposed to one another. And what really became fascinating for me here was to notice that increasingly, and this sort of kept becoming clearer as I worked on the project, these things are fundamentally yoked, that there aren't two cultures, that these things are really mingling freely. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that science was much less professionalized in the mid-19th century, with the fact that scientists needed amateurs to be contributing. So they were creating journals, they were inviting people to discover things, to become explorers in the world of the little. But I think it also had to do with just the fact that what science was revealing was fundamentally challenging what we knew about the world. And that rather than simply expelling sort of previous myths or previous ideas, it's replacing them with something else. So Gaskell has this great quote where he says, like, our fairies are expelled and in the place of them we have, and then he names all these microscopic creatures. But you realize he's describing the same thing. He's really just saying fairies got smaller. He's talking about the possibility, and again, I think the quote is, he talks about a bacteriological Midsummer Night's Dream as the sort of Midsummer Night's Dream of the 19th century. So then thinking about how that scientific culture is also infecting other cultures and is also infusing other discussions has been really fascinating.
Thank you. Here's an interesting question from Constance, and she recognizes this may be a little bit out of your scope, but wondering if you can comment on any insight on the role of miniaturist in the 18th century. She says she realizes it's outside of your focus, but as a Jane Austen fanatic, she thinks that the fascination with miniaturists may have a connection to Jane Austen's focus on very filleting moments that have enormous significance.
Yes. Not really outside my focus. You've got to cover the 18th century some if you do the 19th century too. So
please,
two
no,
things.
she's just fleeting, sorry.
Oh no, I really appreciate that. That's very kind. First of all, just directly to Jane Austen. So Jane Austen has that famous metaphor of herself as a miniaturist. This little bit of ivory 2 or 3 inches wide upon which I work with so fine a brush, producing so little after so much effort, or something like that. But so she is in fact envisioning herself as working on a miniature, and she's thinking about all of the labor that goes into it, like the fact that ivory miniatures are actually incredibly difficult to make. They're incredibly time consuming, and sort of thinking about sort of what it means to be creating on that scale. What then becomes fascinating is that her vision of miniatures does end up being a little bit different if we actually end up looking at sort of her literary representations. So for me, the really important case is that Elizabeth Bennet encounters the miniature of George Wickham, and it does nothing for her when she's visiting Pemberley. It is this sort of sign of an affection that is long gone, even though the object is supposed to be an object of intimacy. She goes into the Great Hall, sees the full-scale portrait of Darcy, hears how wonderful he is from his servants, and thinks, oh my gosh, this is something special. And that's a radically different relationship from some of the sort of later Victorian ideas that something that is small and hidden is better. I think Austen's really drawing out, there's something about the public sphere that's important. And I think we see that with a lot of 18th century miniatures in general, because a lot of them are actually scale miniatures where there'll be miniatures for architectural reasons, there'll be miniatures of sort of more useful objects. And Gulliver's Travels satirizes this to some extent, but they're often much more sort of objects of use. So we see this sort of ongoing pattern in the 18th century where miniatures are good, but really they're a way to steer us towards the full size. Whereas in the 19th century, they stop being so useful and they become these sort of weird enchanting objects. So thank you. That was a great question.
Oh, interesting. That's great. And now the question that keeps coming up, Christine, Penny, Vicky are all wondering, how were these little books created? What was it? As Penny said, can you imagine making those font trays on the printer? How did they manufacture these very tiny books?
Yeah. So what this question draws out is a really important point that I did not make in the talk, which is that these are books that are being made with movable type, right? So these are books that are where each letter is being individually set, where they have to be conceived. And one of the things that's really important about that, so at the very end of the century, photolithography comes in, so you can actually take a full-size book and you can just shrink it down, and suddenly you start getting the souvenir miniature books that are still often sold, you know, at the counters of Barnes & Noble and elsewhere today. Not knocking Barnes & Noble. My son's like favorite book is like one of my childhood miniatures from there. But in the 19th century, you're really reconceiving it. So one of the challenges becomes, how do you, exactly as you're suggesting, how do you set this minuscule type? So several innovations take place starting at the end of the 18th and then beginning in the 19th century, where the type actually, they have new innovations for cutting the type that allows it to be more pristine. And then printers start all trying to figure out ways to make it crisp enough. So one of the problems became not even just the problem of setting it, but the problem that if it was too small, you'd print it a couple times, and then the type would erode down, and then suddenly you'd get the sort of entire sheet the same color, and it would be very difficult to read. So the things with Occhio di Mosca, which was the fly's eye type that I mentioned, those they went through many, many sets of type because it just kept getting broken down. So I think it certainly was damaging the eyesight of those who were working on it, and it certainly was sort of difficult for the material manipulation. But I think a lot of it was actually about creating the machinery that would allow them to be cutting more precisely, that would be allowing them to make the type deeper, and that would be allowing them to get that cleaner imprint. And I think a lot of this was, I mean, it wasn't an economically great proposition, but it was a way to be talking about actually national prestige. So you'd have, the French were very proud of Henri Didot's type, and they said, well, it's not the smallest, but it is the most beautiful in the world. So it becomes this sort of show of prowess in minutia.
That's interesting. In Geneva, I know they sort of started the small Bibles you spoke about originally. They were Bibles and prayer books, and yes, disseminating them and the Reformation out to in different languages, and would sometimes make very small Bibles that could be smuggled into France, for example, in a woman's hairpiece. So it was small enough to go in there, and I found it fascinating. There's the shift in the 19th century from religious objects to saying it's okay to enjoy the miniature world in something that has absolutely nothing to do with God or religious items.
I think that's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, the other miniature that comes to mind right away, very famously, Anne Boleyn carried a prayer book with her to the scaffold, a miniature prayer book with her. And I think that makes sense, because you're thinking, well, you want the words of God with you always. The smallest English book ever printed is something called The Mite, that has gloriously random pieces of information. So like how many like something tin does it take to like stretch the length of the Tower Bridge, like really totally useless things. And the whole idea was that minutia is its own magical world. It doesn't actually have to be, something of value. And I think it's sort of an acknowledgement maybe that all these objects that were ostensibly of value were also things that people were really just enjoying having. And just another note, when we were talking, I think someone asked about jewelers too with books. So most of these books are printed using a printing press, but there was one innovation, and this was showcased at all of the great exhibitions. William Webb, he created this huge like lever, and then you'd like look through a diamond and you could like inscribe things. And he would actually inscribe I think the longest thing he did was the Lord's Prayer, but he would inscribe on the scale of Bibles per square inch. So that was the sort of like scale he was working on, thinking about things that just the Bible rendered into something that is totally apart from any function.
So we have more questions about the books, but I want to go to a couple other questions and we can come back to those. Gary's wondering if you found any evidence of influence in these miniatures from the British Empire in India and the Mughal artists with their miniature art.
So there's a really fascinating, I think there's a really fascinating tradition of British miniaturists traveling to India. So one of the, as part of obviously the sort of imperial project, one of the, I think one of the primary markets was global, both because the idea was you could send someone to India and then they could send a portrait miniature back. So you could actually see your beloved who had been long gone. But also because I think it was tapping into a tradition where miniature forms of art are very highly respected and sort of revered. So I think you can see some influences in those British painters who travel to India in art that is made by non-British artists. But at the same time, they're still painting in watercolor on ivory, which means that everyone's complexion is getting really, really pale, because one of the effects of ivory is that you start white and then you just get ever so slightly darker. So it means that all of these people who actually, by this point, like their complexions are getting a heck of a lot darker, get projected back to England with this sort of incredible pallor. On the other hand, Queen Victoria also commissions cabinet miniature. So it's a fairly substantial miniature of her daughter, Princess Victoria, in Turkish dress. So she's also exporting it outwards and imagining sort of what would it look like to create using this sort of miniature style to export my daughter outwards. So I think there's a sort of fascination, and that of course is also tethering into the fact that ivory is from India and it's from elephant tusks that are from there. So it becomes this sort of exchange. But I think I haven't seen as many artistic influences as I do the sort of like the interesting cultural global history of imperialism.
So Tess is wondering what those prices were like for those miniature books. We'll go back to the books. They're so fascinating. I wonder, could anyone afford them, or was owning them a way to show wealth, as they aren't exactly a necessary object for one's little funds?
They're fairly affordable by the 19th century. And so part of this has to do with the fact that the price of paper goes down substantially. So in the late 18th century, paper was like about 3/4 of the cost of printing in general. And then as paper technologies get better, again, miniature books become more feasible. And often you could print miniature books using scraps of paper. So often people will describe books in terms of how many folds the original sheet of paper has. So a quarto means that you have 4 pages. With 2 folds. Folio is 1 fold, 2 pages. The miniature books, most miniature books are what are called 64 mots, which means that you would be folded to make 64 pages. Some of them are 128 mots. You can't actually fold them that way. That makes no sense whatsoever. So then it became necessary to use the sort of edges of paper that weren't being used. So that was used. But what a lot of miniature book printers would try to do would be that they'd try to actually create scales. So you'd have the affordable version of the relatively affordable to middle class audiences. And unfortunately, I don't have the prices with me at the moment, but relatively affordable copies of the English Bijou Almanac. Then you'd have the copies that have the like really beautiful embroidery. Then you'd have the copies that have the beautiful leather covers. Then you have the copies that have the vellum case with the magnifying glass. And so each one becomes a way of sort of showing like, I spent X amount more on this mostly useless miniature object. And so became a sort of show of prestige. And then those prices dropped dramatically towards the end of the century with photolithography. So suddenly you get miniature books being tucked in with like various perfume bottles and various random cosmetics. And you get this sort of idea of the disposable miniature book as well. And I'd say some of this tradition sort of still stays alive today. I've made reference to Barnes & Noble miniature books. They're also a group of artisanal miniature book makers. They go to the Miniature Book Society, the annual conclave every year. And they are still making things where they'll do 30 copies, they'll do 100 copies, they'll do a couple hundred copies, and they'll be sort of beautifully handcrafted three-dimensional objects. That sort of, that split, I think, exists maybe even in more pronounced form today.
So Vicky's curious. She's visited the Bronte Parsonage, was disappointed, that these books are not there, and curious why they're not kept there, but rather in a university museum.
Yeah. So the miniature books were all in a chest that was discovered after Charlotte Bronte's death, and they were discovered by Charlotte Bronte's husband, and then her friend Elizabeth Gaskell comes upon them as well. And Elizabeth Gaskell, who's also a novelist, she's sort of fascinated but also horrified by what these things are. She's like, these are very cool, but also like, this is not the Charlotte Bronte I particularly want to project to the world. So they actually all ended up getting shipped to Canada and then getting dispersed there. So it's basically Charlotte Bronte's husband doesn't understand them as a part of the sort of Bronte property. And as a result, excerpts and fragments keep surfacing. So there was an article a couple weeks ago about some additional Bronte pieces that just came to market. So there really, a huge number of them are underground. And so those are actually going to be going to be sold relatively soon. So the fact that Harvard has 9 of them, that there are a couple here and a couple there, really has to do with what individual purchasers bought them and then where they decided to bequeath them. And one of the tragedies means that you can't even close to see all of them, and that there's a lot of text where we have some record of what it said, but we haven't actually seen the manuscripts themselves, for 150 years. So, I mean, what additional information might be divulged is this sort of perpetually open question that we are all always hoping for some sort of answer for.
So I'm curious with the dollhouses. I mean, as a child, I built dollhouses and designed them and furnished them and spent hours playing with them, and it was my obsession. And I'm curious, was the original sort of the desire with gifting young girls with dollhouses, with the capacity to make them, to encourage them in a miniature way to prepare for the world of domesticity they would be entering, and then did the young girls somehow subvert that in how they engaged with their miniature worlds?
Yes, it's a great question. So when dollhouses originally started being made, they were these very valuable objects, and they were very detailed. So there are records, there's a record of one widow who, when her husband died, she created I think this is in Antwerp. She bought a baby house. She decorated it to the nines. This is in the 17th century. And then she opened it up for public view and started selling tickets. And she was like, come see my baby house. This is an amazing way to teach your daughter about what her household is going to look like. And I mean, that's how she supported herself, through her baby house. And then we have records of other individuals, girls being tasked with, shining individual pieces of silverware and keeping them in pristine condition. And this meant that the dollhouse had to be locked up. It had to be totally closed, and it had to be not engaged with. And even in the early 19th century, you get some records where children will be describing, well, we liked the dollhouse, but mom and dad had to come, they had to unlock it. We had to be supervised while we were playing with it. And it fundamentally transforms what they're doing. So in the mid-19th century, the change that occurs is it starts being imagined as something that children should be engaging with, and something where they should be making things, they should be creating things. And the ostensible idea is that this is all still going to be for the purposes of domesticity. But as soon as you've opened up the dollhouse, like you've opened up a can of miniature worms, you've opened up all of these possibilities for subversive play. And I think in particular, there are a lot of records of really destructive and violent play with dolls. Sharon Marcus has talked about this as a potential sort of mimicry, where girls are doing to their dolls what their mothers are doing to them, which is a very, obviously, it's a powerful reading. I read them very differently because actually a lot of the violence is understood as like, well, you need a doll with enough enduring force that you can like whack her a couple times and like put her near the fire and her nose doesn't melt off. And like sometimes girls would like take wax dolls and they'd accidentally behead them because they'd be like playing with strings. There were all these violent things, but they weren't really understood as these girls are bad. The girls are playing with them. You need a doll with enough, I love Louisa May Alcott has the phrase dollanity, like humanity, you know, with enough dollanity that you can keep whacking her around for a while and she'll survive. And that in fact means that girls are invited to do it, right? Because you've got to get them the stout enough toys. And British periodicals talk about German toys you just look at, British toys you whack around, you play with, you think they're real. And so that really is the thing that suddenly, it doesn't quite say they're supposed to do it, but boy, it opens the door. And then that really transforms, I think, childhood play forever.
Oh, that's really fascinating. This has been just such an enjoyable talk. Thank you so much, Laura. I hope everybody will join me in thanking Laura Forsberg for a fascinating evening. Check out the book. We have it, you can get it at bookshop.org, an online independent bookstore that supports independent bookstores, and a portion of the proceeds go to your independent bookstore as well as to the Athenaeum. You can also check it out at our library if you are an Athenaeum member. So we hope you will pick it up and read it and learn a bit more. We're so grateful for your time. People are saying, great talk. Loved it so much. Thank you, says Rosanna. Caroline, thank you so much. A lot of great responses in the chat. So everyone, thank you for coming. I hope you will attend future programs. We are drawing near to the end of our spring series. On June 22nd. We will have a wonderful conversation with Taya Nguyen, who is the Executive Director of the Community Design Collaborative here in Philadelphia. Talk about architects and design and what is happening in Philadelphia. Should be another fascinating conversation. And Stephen Wertheim, on his book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy in World War II and Beyond. And that should, again, be another fascinating historical conversation, which kind of wraps up our global look at the world that we've been doing this spring. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletters that come out on Monday morning and let you know all you need to know about what we are doing. Follow us on social media. And I heard, someone said that they would, they're putting on their bucket list to visit the Huntington and to visit the Kansas City miniature museum. And I encourage people to, if you're on Instagram or Facebook, to look them up and follow them so you can follow both of them. I follow the Huntington and just love in the middle of the winter to get those images from the Huntington of everything in bloom is lovely. Vicki, yes, we do programs in collaboration with Preservation Alliance. Paul Steinke, Preservation Alliance are wonderful people. So follow them as well and attend their programs as well. We look forward to seeing all of you again in person and virtually. And Laura, look forward to welcoming you in person to the Athenaeum when your travels find you in Philadelphia. And wish everyone a great evening.